everyone and welcome to the internet. What we're going to be doing in today's lesson is having a look at classification systems. So hopefully by the end of this lesson you're going to be able to describe how we classify organisms and how we actually name them as well. To start off though, we've got 4 questions based around our previous lesson, so have a go at answering these 4 in your books, and I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to do this. Let's mark our answers then. So for question 1, hopefully you got Charles Darwin, 1 mark for that one. Question 2, we find older fossils deeper underground, 1 mark for that. Question 3, 2 marks available here. First mark is for saying we gather fossils from different depths, and the second mark is for saying that allows us to see how the organism has changed over time. And then question 4, closely related species will have more DNA sequences in common with one another. Add it up, you've got a mark out of 5 today. Now, before we jump into scientific classification, then I thought we'd start with a more basic version. So what we've actually got, a range of different shapes at the bottom there. What I'd like you to do is classify them into groups, so put them into groups of your choosing. And obviously, once you put them into those groups, just write down a sentence to say how you classified them. Once you've done that, see if you can write a definition for the word classification. Now, in terms of the shapes, there are a number of ways that you could have classified them. So we could have obviously done it based on the squares, the triangles and the circles. So you could have had a group of squares, a group of triangles, a group of circles. You could have done it based on their colours. You could have done it based on size. So there's a range of different ways that we could have grouped those shapes. When it comes to the definition for classification, what we hopefully have got is the one on the screen here. That classification is where we're sorting living organisms into groups based on their similar characteristics. So make sure you've got that definition written down if yours doesn't match it, and then see if you can suggest why it is that as scientists we classify organisms. What's the point behind us doing that? What we actually have are three key reasons why scientists are going to be classifying organisms. The first one is to just identify species. If you imagine how many different organisms there are here on planet Earth, then we can't just use general terms about them. It's far easier if we've got a group and we know what that actually means, so that when we say it's an animal, we know certain features about it. So it allows us to identify and make some sense of this vast number of organisms that exist. Secondly, we can predict characteristics of any organisms within that particular group because they share those common characteristics. And thirdly, it allows us to show evolutionary links. So what that means is we can look at all these different organisms and then piece together almost like a planetary family tree of how different species are then interconnected in their histories and their evolutionary paths. What we now need to do is dive a little bit deeper and see how we classify things here on Earth. And what we actually have in order to do this are 7 taxonomic levels. So this is 7 levels of classification, if you like. And what we have on the screen here are those 7 levels. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. These are all different ways that we can classify. So the kingdom is the largest of all of those groups. So that would have the most diversity of all of the organisms within it. But by the time we get down to species, that is a single organism. So we go from the kingdom, which is quite large, each step getting smaller and smaller in terms of the number of species present, until we're left with just the one individual species at the end. So write down those 7 taxonomic levels and then see if you can write a mnemonic to help you remember these. So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to have a go at your mnemonic. If you want to share your mnemonics with me, then obviously stick them in the comments at the bottom, because other students may also find them really useful. Now, if we have a look at how these classification systems work then, if we start with the kingdoms then, what we have on planet Earth are 5 kingdoms that every living thing on our planet can be classified into. So what we can do is split up every single organism on planet Earth into one of these 5 kingdoms. And the ones we've got are plants, animals, fungi, protoctista, and prokaryotes. So plants, animals, fungi, hopefully those ones are pretty familiar to you. Prokaryotes, hopefully that's bringing back memories of B1 where we talked about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So prokaryotic are those bacterial cells if you remember. And then the protoctista are a slightly more unique group if you like, and you won't have encountered those yet. But protoctistans are another kingdom that we can actually classify into. So generally speaking, if it doesn't fit into plants, animals, fungi or prokaryotes, then it would be in the protoctistans. Now the protoctista are actually just simple eukaryotic organisms. So this would be things like red algae, green algae and the like. So they're just the simple eukaryotic organisms. Before we actually look and see this classification system in action, then we need to know one other key definition, which is that of a species. Now, this one used to come up as a 2-mark question really frequently. So it's one of those definitions that's really important to learn. So again, highlight it, put it in a box, make it stand out somehow, and then create a flashcard, species on one side and its definition on the other. When we're talking about a species, we are talking about a group of organisms that are able to reproduce, first mark, to produce fertile offspring. That was always the second mark. So organisms that are able to reproduce to produce fertile offspring. If we now have a little look to see how this classification system works then, we'll start off with these pictures which are all representatives of the animal kingdom. So what we've got here is a whale shark in the top left, a spider, a gorilla, a dog, a cat, a human, monkey and a parrotfish. Now if we look at those pictures we can see they're all pretty different to each other, and yet we're all in the animal kingdom together. So if we were to only classify using kingdoms, then we end up with this massive and diverse group of everything from us as humans down to spiders and fish. Now I don't know about you, but I feel a little bit different to a spider or a fish. So that's just our first level. That's the animal kingdom. So if we now split it to go into the phylum, then the phylum we're going to look at are the vertebrates. So the vertebrates phylum are those with obviously vertebrae, so they've got a backbone. Now we've got the whale shark, the parrotfish is still there, the monkey, the gorilla, the dog, the cat and the humans. The only thing we've taken out from the ones that we'd selected this time were spiders. But we're starting to make it smaller. So the next step in classification is to go to the class, and in this case we're going to look at the class of mammals. So what we've now lost are the whale shark and the parrotfish. which still leaves us with dogs, cats, gorillas, monkeys and us as humans. So still not quite there, because I'm quite different to a cat and a dog, still not feeling that I'm there yet with this classification. Our next category is the order, and in this case we're looking at the order of primates. So at this point we've got rid of the dog and the cat, and we're now just left with a group with gorillas, monkeys and us as human beings. Hopefully, even though we can see that we're getting more closely related, you're still not sitting there and thinking, this is it, this is the last bit of our classification. If I look at a gorilla, I can't tell the difference between the gorilla and myself. Hopefully that's not the case. So if we come down one more step in our classification, we get to the family. And in this case, our family is going to be Hominidae. Now, when we go into the family of Hominidae, then we lose the monkeys. So it's just us and gorillas. But still not there, so we've got to go another step, which leads us on to the genus. Now, in terms of us as humans, our genus is Homo. Now, Homo isn't just what we are today, that covers early versions of humans as well. So what we can see in the pictures here is everything from current humans to some of our earlier ancestors there, but all of us in the genus of Homo. Which brings us to our last step, which is the species. So as humans in the modern day, our species is sapiens. So we are referred to as Homo sapiens. So it's the genus and the species, that's what makes up our name. So every single human being alive on the planet today is a Homo sapien. Now we've got these groups, but we need to then be able to fit organisms into them. It's all good and fine just having a group with a special name, but unless we know how to put these different organisms into those groups, classification doesn't work. So what we have are a couple of different systems of classification. So the first one is artificial classification. Now this is where we're going to be using observable characteristics. And by that I mean what we're going to use are features you can literally look at an organism and say, well, it's got wings, therefore it's going into this group. What this one doesn't do is consider any evolutionary relationships. So while it's pretty straightforward to use, because all we need to do is look at the organism, identify those observable characteristics and then fit it into the group that also has those characteristics, it doesn't consider any of those evolutionary relationships, which are actually really important to understanding life on planet Earth as a whole. What I've given you at the bottom of the screen there is a picture of a creature that used to exist here on planet Earth called Archaeopteryx. They are now extinct, they don't run around still looking like that, and pretty glad about that. But what I want you to do is, looking at that image, suggest the problem of using the artificial classification system for Archaeopteryx. Hopefully what we saw there, just by looking at the image, you might have kind of got to this point where you look at it and think, well, it's going to be a bird. It's got wings, it's got feathers, must be a bird. But then when you look at its head, it certainly doesn't look like any kind of bird I've ever seen. That head looks more like a reptile to me, or a lizard. So what we actually have are two different groups with features on one organism. So that's a problem for us using our artificial classification system, is if we do come across a particular organism that's got features of more than one group, we hit a problem of where do we put it? The second type of classification system we can use is one called natural classification. Now, the natural classification system is based on these evolutionary relationships, and we work these out through analysing the DNA of all these different organisms. Now, there is a branch of science called phylogeny, which is where we're studying the evolutionary links through studying their DNA. So this is obviously a relatively new branch of science, because you go back just 70 years, we had no clue what DNA even really was. So what we've seen in more recent times is, as we've developed the technology and the understanding of how to sequence genomes of different organisms, we've then been able to look at all these different genomes and compare them. And when I say we've done that, we've got a supercomputer to do it, basically. There's not someone sitting there in a lab with all of the printouts of the DNA strands going, right, A, T, oh, there's a C, that's different. It's all done by computer. But it's looking at the DNA and it's identifying how much of that is in common with each organism. So the more similar their DNA, the closer related they are. And that means that the divergence in their family tree occurred more recently. Once we've actually analysed the DNA, then what we can do is build up this phylogenetic family tree. So similar to if your family do family trees themselves, so looking at who married who in the past and which children they had and how it all ties together, but this time it's all based around DNA. So if we look at the one I've given you here, then we can see right at the very top of the screen, that's the present day, and the further down we go, then that's getting further and further into the past. So that's obviously many millions of years ago. And what we can see is, up in the top right corner, there's Homo sapiens. So just one in from the top right corner. Then, if we go all the way down to the bottom, we can see that's our early ancestor, the hominin ancestor. So what we have is, about 6 million years ago, there's this ancestor. And we see this divergence, so you can see it splits into the two different arms around 5 million years ago. One of them comes up to become the modern day chimpanzee, and the other one goes through a series of different branches until it gets to us as Homo sapiens. So this is where that whole thing that Darwin said about, man being from a common ancestor with monkeys, this is where people sort of said, well, man and monkeys, and did those little pictures of Charles Darwin's head stuck onto the body of a monkey and things like this. Because he didn't say that chimpanzees and us, we didn't descend from chimpanzees. He said that chimpanzees and us share a common ancestor. And by that, we don't mean someone just a few hundred years ago, a few thousand years ago. You can see here, 6 million years ago. That's quite a long time in the grand scheme of things. But what we've built up here then is our phylogeny to show the family tree. Now, what we can see as we go through is we've got these different versions of humans as we've evolved over those 6 million years. So if you look down towards the bottom, you can see that actually, compared to a chimpanzee, some of our earlier ancestors really did look quite similar. And then as we start to come further up, you can see the one in the bottom right there, that's actually Lucy. So she's been recreated, that's why it looks so good, because they've made a recreation based on the fossils of her skeleton. And that's what she looked like. And that's about 3.5-ish million years ago. And then we keep coming up our family tree, and eventually we get to Homo sapiens. So we can see how we've evolved over time. Now, we've been able to do this because we've got the fossil record that shows these different stages. So we've been able to find fossils with the skulls and the like, so we can reconstruct what their heads would have looked like. And then we can compare, obviously, DNA in order to work out which order they go in terms of evolution. Because the more closely related their DNA, then the closer they are on this family tree. The only other bit we need to look at today then is the binomial nomenclature, or binomial naming system. Now, what we actually have here is a name for every single species on planet Earth. And this name is made up of two parts, hence binomial. Bi meaning two, nomial, name. So what we actually have is a two-part name for every single organism here on planet Earth. And it's made up of the genus and the species. So because we are Homo sapiens, our genus is Homo, the species sapiens. That's why we're Homo sapiens. And when we write these, there's really important rules to remember. Firstly, the genus should have a capital letter, and the species always lowercase. And then if you're doing this all properly, you should either be writing it in italics, but because very few of us write in italics, just underline it, because that shows it's the proper naming system, and that's how we actually write it in science. Now, what we've got as another example is Panthera leo. So Panthera is the genus, the species is Leo. One of the things they can ask you to do is to actually write down the genus or the species when they've given you this binomial name. So as long as you know the genus is the first word, the species is the second, then you'll be able to answer that correctly each time. So the final thing for today then, and the final thing in B5, so this is the end of our 5th biology unit, is the plenary questions. So 3 questions for you to have a go at in your books. Obviously, take your time and answer them. I'm going to leave this up for about 2 minutes today, but if you need longer, hit pause and take as long as you need to answer the questions properly.